She no longer heard the sounds of the city as she once did. The horns that once seemed like symphonies were now just noise. The building's elevator made a mournful creak, almost as if lamenting each return trip. Margaret, with her neatly combed white hair and her usual pale pink lipstick, looked out the window of her small Chicago apartment and sighed. It was as if something inside her was tired. But it wasn't just her body. Every day had been the same since Harold left. The radio played the same old songs, and the smell of coffee filled the empty kitchen. She had friends in the building, of course. But even the bingo meetings had lost their luster. The constant noise of the city seemed to mock her inner silence. Time passed, but she didn't feel alive. It was one Sunday morning that everything began to change, although she didn't know it yet. She tripped while trying to reach a tall box in the closet, and inside fell a yellowed letter. Before I continue, I want to say that I ask God to bless you with all His infinite love, giving you much health, peace, joy, and faith, for we can never lose faith in God, for He will never abandon us, for His love is eternal and infinite. I also take this opportunity to ask you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. This helps me a lot, thank you. Now, where were we? Ah, yes, the letter. The handwriting was familiar, and the paper smelled of old wood. Margaret sat up slowly, her eyes welling up as she recognized the sender's name, her older brother, who had died years ago. The letter had been written decades earlier, when he still lived on the family farm. There were words of longing and a persistent invitation. If the city ever weighs too much on you, come here. The countryside heals. She froze. Was this a calling? Chicago was changing too. The bakery she loved closed its doors. The park where she took her grandchildren now felt unsafe and dirty. Even her upstairs neighbor, always so friendly, had moved out. And the sound of ambulances wouldn't stop. With each passing day, she felt more out of place, more forgotten. It was as if the city was telling her it no longer belonged there. Margaret tried to ignore the feeling. She tried to fill the void with new online courses, with gardening in makeshift pots on the balcony. But nothing filled it. It was like trying to water an artificial plant. And the strangest thing, her dreams began to change. In the silence of the night, she dreamed of green fields, running horses, and the laughter of children she didn't even know. She spoke to her daughter, Emily. She told her about the letter, about the discomfort in her chest that wouldn't go away. Emily was amused at first, but then she saw the sparkle in her mother's eyes as she spoke of the past. "Mommy, do you really want to go to a farm now?" At 72. Margaret just smiled. She didn't answer. But something inside her had responded long ago. That week, the city seemed noisier than ever. A fire in a nearby building, an argument in the hallway, a robbery at the corner drugstore. Margaret watched it all on TV with a strange feeling, as if she were a spectator in a movie she was no longer a part of. It was as if God were whispering, "It's time." And then came the day the elevator broke down. Margaret had to walk up 6 floors, bags in hand. When she reached the top, panting, she dropped everything on the floor and collapsed onto the sofa. She cried. Not from physical pain, but from sheer exhaustion. That was the last straw. The moment she realized, this isn't where I want to spend the rest of my life. She began looking through old photos. He found a picture of her at 25, standing with her brother in front of a red barn. Both of them smiling, their faces sun-streaked. She remembered the smell of the countryside, the sound of crickets at night. It was all so real in her memory, so much more vivid than anything I had now. In the following days, something changed. Margaret began donating things. Clothes she no longer wore, used books, even valuables. Letting go, she told herself. But it went deeper than that. It was as if she were saying goodbye to a life that no longer made sense. And with each box donated, he felt lighter. Emily called back, worried. "Mommy, is everything okay?" Margaret replied calmly, "I've never been so sure of anything in my life." Her daughter didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "Are you really going to do this?" The answer came like a prayer. "If God is with me, why should I be afraid?" And so she wrote to the family lawyer, wanting to know if the old farm was still in her brother's name. The reply came 3 days later, with a detail that would change everything. The property was now hers. Inherited silently years ago, forgotten by everyone, except fate. What no one knew was that the farm was waiting for her. Margaret didn't tell anyone right away. She spent days just looking at the map of the region, remembering the route, the smells, the stories. It was as if her soul were leading the way, recognizing the terrain. Her heart beat differently now. Calmer. More steadier. Like a compass finally pointing true north. On her last night in the apartment, she did something symbolic. She lit a candle, put on a Louis Armstrong record, and danced alone around the living room. She laughed, cried, prayed. She gave thanks for the city, for the joys and pains, for the loves she'd experienced there. But above all, she gave thanks for being alive, alive enough to start over. The next day, the taxi arrived early. The doorman was surprised by the bags. "Are you going on a trip, Mrs. Margaret?" She replied with a sweet smile, "No. I'm going home." He didn't understand, but God did. Because sometimes, a new beginning comes at the end. And the end isn't always what it seems. As the car crossed the city's last avenue, she didn't look back. She knew that if she did, she might hesitate. And she didn't want to hesitate. She'd already wasted too much time clinging to the past. Now, it was time to trust. To believe that there are promises God holds for us, even when we forget. The road seemed endless, but she felt no rush. Every mile was a prayer. Every tree was a reminder that God's creation is perfect. She whispered psalms as she watched the fields approach. And when she finally saw the wooden sign with the farm's name, time stood still. She stepped out of the car carefully. The air was different. Purer. Thicker. As if heaven were closer there. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of meaning. And when her feet touched the ground at the entrance, she knew. This wasn't just dirt. It was holy ground. It was the ground of promises. Margaret walked to the porch of the house, still holding the antique keys. Wood creaked beneath her footsteps. The sun beat down just as it had in her dreams. And as she opened the door, she felt no fear. She felt peace. A peace that only comes when we're finally where we should have been all along. But what she didn't know yet was that that house hid more than memories. There were secrets hidden there. And one of them, I was about to change everything again. The house seemed to breathe with her. Every corner held an ancient whisper, a memory stored in the silence of the wood. Margaret spent the first few days cleaning little by little, with care, almost as if caring for a sacred reliquary. And it was on a mild, windy afternoon that she decided to open the closet in her brother's old bedroom. A rustic piece of furniture, made of dark wood, covered in a fine layer of dust from time to time. At the bottom of the bottom drawer, beneath folded handkerchiefs and a broken pocket watch, she found something she hadn't expected. A sheaf of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. Her hands trembled as she untied the ribbon. The paper was yellowed, and some of the edges were torn with age. But the handwriting, oh, the handwriting was unmistakable. It was hers. And then it all came rushing back. The afternoons she'd written to her brother about the city. The replies he'd never sent. She thought he didn't read them, but there they all were. Carefully stored. Read, perhaps reread. It touched something deep. It was more than paper. It was preserved affection. An invisible bond that spanned decades. There was one in particular, set apart from the others. A distinctive envelope, dark blue. When she opened it, she found not a letter, but a will. Simple, direct, with few words. Her brother left her the farm, with everything inside. Margaret felt a lump in her throat. With everything inside, what did that mean? On the back of the will was a handwritten sentence. What could not be said is kept in the barn. It was like a bolt of lightning. The barn. She hadn't been there yet. This was more than an instruction. It was a call. An invitation to discover what had been left unfinished. And suddenly, the field stopped being just a refuge. It became a mystery. She spent the rest of the day staring out the window at the barn. There was something solemn about that red structure. It wasn't just wood and hay. It was history. And maybe, answers. That night, she barely slept. She prayed quietly, asking for discernment. Lord, if there's something I need to know, show it to me in your time. But deep down, She knew the time was now. Early in the morning, with a scarf around her neck and her brother's boots on her feet, she walked to the barn. The hinges groaned as they opened, as if awakening from a long sleep. The smell of straw and memory filled the air. And at the back, under a blue tarp, she saw something covered. She walked slowly, her heart racing. Lifting the tarp, she found a chest. Made of iron. Locked. But next to it, a key hung on a rusty nail. It was as if everything was waiting for her. She knelt, took a deep breath, and turned the key. The click was soft, but what she found inside made the world stop for a moment. Photos. Hundreds of them. Of family. Of neighbors. Of parties. And among them, a letter addressed to Margaret. Handwritten, in a firm handwriting. It was from her brother. It began, "If you're reading this, it's because you're finally back." She covered her mouth with her hand. The tears came silently. And she kept reading. "I knew you would return one day. Not out of longing, but by destiny. This house was always yours, even when you didn't know it. I kept everything, waited for you. Here, you will find more than memories. You will find yourself. And maybe, a new mission." Margaret clutched the letter to her chest. That man, so silent, had left an entire legacy in silence. And now, the countryside was beginning to speak. In the days that followed, she organized the photos. She began identifying faces, noting dates. She discovered neighbors who still lived nearby. People who remembered her as a girl, running through the cornfields. One afternoon, she knocked on the door of Mrs. June, her neighbor on the next farm. A bright-eyed, firm-voiced woman. "I knew you'd come back," she said without hesitation. "Your brother said that when the wind changed, you'd come." Margaret smiled. "And it seems the wind has changed." The two spent hours talking. June told stories about Margaret's brother that she never knew. He was known as the country pastor, even though he never held a pulpit. He helped widows, taught children, prayed with the sick. And he left Bible notes in jam jars for passers-by. Margaret laughed, cried, and was moved. It was like meeting her brother for the first time. She discovered he kept a diary. That he'd recorded everything. And that perhaps he'd left clues there. She returned home that night feeling alive. As if God were revealing each piece, like someone piecing together a sacred puzzle. The next morning, she found the diary in her old room. It was tucked inside a Bible, marked for Psalm 91. She read the verses aloud, feeling as if heaven itself were listening. "1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you." It was a promise. And also a warning. The diary began with dates from the 1980s. It told of plantations, storms, and loneliness. But gradually, the accounts became more spiritual. Revelations. Dreams. Messages the brother believed came from God. And one passage caught his attention. She needs to go back. Because the family secret is with her. And only she can reveal it. Margaret closed the diary, trembling. What did he mean by, "the secret is with her"? She remembered nothing. But that night, she dreamed of her father. A vivid, almost real dream. He was sitting on the porch, reading a letter. And looking at her, he said, "You must remember." When she woke, the sky was gray. And the barn seemed darker than usual. In the following days, Margaret began having flashbacks. Small memories from her childhood. Scenes of her mother crying in the kitchen. Her father arguing with someone on the porch. And always, her brother between them, trying to protect them. There was a trauma there. Something her mind had erased. But her heart remembered. She prayed for clarity. She cried out for light. And slowly, she began to put the pieces together. A name popped into her mind, Abigail. But who was Abigail? She couldn't remember anyone with that name. She decided to search through the old papers in the house. And then she found a birth certificate. Abigail, her sister. The shock was immense. Margaret grew up believing she was an only child. But there was the document. Abigail Elizabeth Miller. Born 2 years before her. And missing at just 3 years old. Her family had hidden it from her entire life. What had happened to little Abigail? Margaret felt her legs weaken. She sat on the living room floor, surrounded by papers, her heart racing. This was bigger than her. It was as if a curtain had been drawn back before her eyes. And suddenly, everything made sense. The unexplained pain, her father's silences, her mother's sadness. She picked up her brother's diary again. She flipped through it quickly. And there it was. Abigail is alive. I know she is. One day, Margaret will understand. And when she does, she will find it. Those words burned. A new purpose was born there. And the letter forgotten in the back of the drawer, had changed everything. Margaret had set foot in this land before, but never as its owner. The house was made of weathered wood, with wide windows and a porch that creaked with every step. The wind made the curtains dance, as if in welcome. The surrounding nature seemed at peace, as if it knew she had returned to the right place. It was the beginning of something, even if she didn't yet know what. The first few hours were silent. No cars, no alarms, no neighbors shouting. Just the sound of birds and the creaking of wood. Margaret took off her shoes and stepped onto the floor as if treading on sacred ground. Every corner of the house seemed to hold an echo of the past. And she felt that silence speak louder than 1,000 words. She opened the pantry and found glass jars, some with handmade labels. Blackberry jam, peach jam, pickles. Everything was organized with the same care her brother always had. It was as if he were still there, in every detail. The kitchen smelled of childhood, of fresh coffee, of Sunday pancakes. Home was beginning to breathe with her. In the living room, a stone fireplace. Above it, an old black-and-white photo. It was the whole family, but next to her mother, a little girl she didn't immediately recognize. Curly hair, shy smile. Only later did she realize it was Abigail. And then, the farm was no longer just a refuge. It was also a living trail, a witness to what had been forgotten. She spent the first few days cleaning carefully. She didn't want to erase the past, but rather make room for the present to flourish. Every piece of furniture had a story. The rocking chair that creaked at dusk. The chest filled with prayer books, hand underlined. The Bible opened to Psalm 46, as if someone had stopped reading and never returned. God is our refuge and strength. At night, the house seemed to whisper. The creaking of the walls, the sound of the wind, even the chirping of the crickets. Everything formed a melody of reconnection. Margaret prayed before bed, sitting on the edge of her bed. Lord, if this is your will, show me the way. And the way came. Not in roads, but in memories, people, signs. One day, opening a desk drawer, she found a small wooden cross hanging by a leather cord. It was accompanied by a note, "Wear it when you need to remember who you are." She placed it around her neck reverently. The cross touched her skin like an ancient embrace. It was as if her brother had left fragments of faith scattered everywhere. Margaret discovered there was much to learn about the countryside. The routine was tough but invigorating. Rising with the sun, tending the garden, feeding the chickens. Every small task was a victory. And as much as she missed the city at times, there was something there she'd never had in Chicago: purpose. One day, she received a visit from a man named Jacob, the former caretaker. A friendly gentleman, wearing a straw hat, and with a firm voice. "Are you John's sister?" he asked. Margaret nodded. He smiled. "He talked about you every day. He said you had the strongest heart he'd ever seen. That one day you'd come back, and change everything." Jacob began helping her with the heavier tasks. He was a gentle soul with many stories to tell. He spoke of bountiful harvests, of harsh droughts, of how John always shared what he had. Margaret listened attentively. Each story filled in the gaps. It was as if she were discovering her brother for the first time. Little by little, Margaret began writing too. Simple journals, notes, prayers. A way to record her journey. A way to talk to God. She wrote about the changes in the sky, the smell of wet earth, the voices the wind seemed to carry. The house had become her temple. One late afternoon, while watering the vegetables, she noticed an envelope buried in a ceramic pot. Inside was a photo of John holding a baby. On the back, God knows the right time for everything. Margaret clutched the photo to her chest. Could it be Abigail? Or her own grandson? The doubt sowed another open cycle. But she already knew. Some answers were coming slowly. Margaret decided to restore the abandoned back room. It was small, with windows overlooking the orchard. As she painted the walls white, she felt something blossom inside her. With each brushstroke, a new thought emerged. And the most constant of all was, maybe this house is preparing me for something greater. One morning, while collecting eggs from the chicken coop, she heard a sweet voice in the distance. It was a little girl, laughing. But there were no children around. She ran to the fence and looked around. Nothing. The sound had disappeared. But not the feeling. It was as if God had whispered, "She is near." Who? Margaret didn't know. But her heart was pounding. The community began to notice her. At the local grocery store, she was called John's sister. People stopped to chat, offer help, and reminisce about old stories. A woman named Helen told her about a harvest festival John hosted every year. She was the lifeblood of the neighborhood, she said. Margaret decided she would bring this tradition back. While preparing for the party, she found a closet full of antique decorations. Handmade flags, fairy lights stored in boxes, plates painted with verses. It was all simple, yet soulful. Each object seemed to carry blessings, prayers, and laughter. And as she touched each one, Margaret felt something rebuild within her. While tidying up, a small box fell from the top of a cabinet. Inside were antique rings. One of them was engraved with the initials A.M. Abigail Miller. Or could it be someone else? Margaret felt her blood run cold. Something in that box seemed important, but its meaning was still hidden. Another mystery. On the porch at dusk, she wrote letters she would never send. Letters to Abigail, to John, to God. It was her way of communicating with everything she didn't yet understand. But there was hope in the words. A new, fresh hope, born along with the scent of wildflowers and the distant call of owls at dusk. Jacob said there was a basement in the house, sealed for decades. Your brother never wanted to open it again. He said that's where he slept when he needed to rest. Margaret felt a shiver. Maybe the secret was there. But it wasn't time yet. Everything in its own time. God revealed things at just the right pace. Not before, not after. That night, a storm descended on the farm. Margaret lit candles, read psalms aloud, and listened to the thunder as if hearing the voice of an old friend. The house shook, but it held firm. Not by its own strength, but because it felt the divine presence. For the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of solitude. Because I knew I wasn't alone. The next morning, a rainbow formed over the field. Margaret went barefoot, walked through the puddles, and gave thanks aloud. Thank you, Lord, for bringing me here, for not giving up on me. It was a new beginning, but also a mission. Something to be discovered, something to be healed. But what Margaret didn't yet know was that the barn held more than just photos, and that an old acquaintance was about to knock on the door. A face from the past. A truth that would challenge everything. Because sometimes God takes us back, not just to heal, but to reveal what we never knew we needed to know. The barn stood there, silent and imposing, like a guardian of the farm's mysteries. The reddish boards showed the wear of years, but held firm. Margaret cautiously opened the creaking door, taking a deep breath. Inside, bundles of hay, old tools, and long shadows. The place exuded nostalgia, but also enigma. She turned on a flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom. The floor creaked beneath her feet. Some box was stacked in a dark corner. She approached, her heart pounding. Each step brought back memories she hadn't even known she held. The old barn seemed to pulse as if it held living secrets. While moving a stack of grain sacks, she found a fallen board, loosened by corroded nails. Behind it was a narrow gap, a hidden compartment. She hesitated, breathed, and entered the space. The musty smell mingled with the sweet scent of ancient wood. Inside, something was stored. It was a smaller chest, made of ubiquitous wood with intricate carvings. She touched the lid reverently, and as she lifted it, the creak echoed throughout the barn. Inside were diaries, letters, and objects from her brother's youth, but there was also something that made her heart stop for a moment. An old portrait, Margaret as a child, cradled in the lap of a small girl she didn't recognize. The photograph was clear, the two of them, embracing, smiling, in a field of flowers. The girl had curious eyes and a familiar expression. Abigail. The missing child. The image challenged everything she thought she knew. And at that point, the barn stopped being just a place of memory. It became a convergence point for hidden truths. Inside the trunk, next to the photo, was a letter in an envelope sealed with red wax. The handwriting resembled her brother's. The letter read, "For when she was ready." Margaret gripped the envelope with trembling hands and felt a chill run down her spine. What was written there could shake everything. But she opened it anyway. The letter revealed something no one ever expected. Abigail lived nearby, under a different name. That she had been adopted by another family after an accident. That her brother watched from afar, caring silently. That he had always hoped to reunite the sisters one day. Margaret stopped reading and took a deep breath. Could it be true? At the bottom of the trunk, she also found a small metal box with a reliquary. Inside were two medallions with the initials, M and A. And inside each medallion were strands of hair and small engraved dates. 48, 66. The most incredible thing of all lay before her. The medallions revealed identities. Average birth dates. As she held the medallions, the barn seemed to tremble slightly. A cold wind blew through the cracks in the wood. Margaret felt a sense of foreboding. She looked around again. Shadows danced, the beam of the lantern trembled. It was as if the place were waking up. Something was about to emerge. She carefully put the objects away and reverently closed the hidden compartment. The trunk, however, began to creak as if wanting to be opened again. Margaret felt an inner tremor. The past was restless. It pulsed. Something was watching them. But it was too soon to know. She already knew she would have to return more often. Over the next few days, the barn became her searching ground. Every morning she returned with flashlights, notes, and renewed courage. Each new discovery seemed to spark more questions. Who made those shadows move? Who wanted to hide it all? The field she thought simple revealed itself to be full of deep veins. She wrote down every date, every name, every trace in her diary. She began to trace chronologies: Abigail's disappearance, her brother's travels, her parents' absences. And in the midst of it all, a gap, the year 1967. Something hidden happened that year. The curtains of the past were being torn apart. One afternoon, she heard footsteps in the barn as she was recording her findings. She stood up abruptly and shone the flashlight on her face. No one. Just the echo of her heartbeat. The shadow of a figure seemed to move behind a pile of tools. She took a deep breath and called out, "Is anyone there?" But only silence answered. The mystery grew. That night, she dreamed of Abigail holding her hand in a field of flowers. The girl whispered, "Find me." Margaret woke with cold hands, her heart pounding. The barn seemed to beckon. She knew she had to return. That every step inside would be decisive. That God, up above, revealed secrets to those brave enough to seek. The next day, she took Jacob with her to the barn. He held the flashlight and murmured, "Something good has always been stored here." They knelt, examining the floor. They found old scratches, hook marks on the ceiling, and a torn piece of paper stuck in a crack. An old newspaper clipping, "Missing girl in the area, 1967." The missing date. The clipping suggested Abigail had disappeared near the creek behind the field. Jacob frowned. That creek used to dry up in the summer. Maybe someone took advantage of it. The twist came: Abigail could have been trapped or hidden there. The barn was just a starting point. But the river, oh, the river, made everything more urgent. Margaret felt the weight of the revelation. More than emotion, indignation. Why had they kept this a secret? Why had they hidden it from her? And why, even so, had John always waited for her to return? The questions swirled like a hurricane. And amidst the whirlwind, a seed of hope sprouted. She would find Abigail. Returning to the trunk, she opened the hidden will again to reread the sentence, "What could not be said is stored in the barn." Now she understood. It was true. But perhaps she needed help to decipher it all. That night, she prayed fervently for clarity. And she heard a soft voice in her heart. "Continue. Trust. I will reveal." It was God speaking, and she believed. She decided to investigate the records of the neighboring town. Adoption records, disappearance records, censuses. She took files from the local library and scanned old newspaper pages. Her hands trembled as she read names similar to Abigail's, but spelled differently. There were scattered clues, fragments of lives. And in each fragment, hope. During one of these searches, he found a letter addressed to a Springfield family, different name, that said, "Receive Abigail with love. I promise to watch from afar." The sender was John Miller. The revelation was overwhelming. He knew where she was, but chose to observe her from afar. Perhaps because he feared the truth would do more harm than good, or perhaps because of deep love. Margaret felt dizzy. Her entire life had been built on omission. But now, the power of truth burned in her chest. She returned to the barn with the envelope containing the letter. She carefully placed everything in the trunk. She summoned the courage to move forward. The barn had revealed much, but it still held the final piece of the puzzle. The next morning, she saw a figure in the distance, by the stream. Someone silent. A familiar figure. She didn't run. She approached slowly, her heart pounding. The figure turned, and her eyes recognized souls that time had not erased. An unexpected reunion was about to happen. She opened her mouth to speak, but stopped. The figure held something out. A medallion, identical to the one she'd found in the trunk. The figure extended its hand. Margaret felt the world spin. What seemed impossible was beginning to become real. Past and present would collide in that moment. And everything would depend on the next word. The neighborhood in the countryside was different. Everyone knew everyone else. Everyone knew everyone else, but not everyone told everyone everything. Margaret had heard of June Harper, who had lived on the property next door for over 40 years. A widow, childless, devout, and known for her sharp memory and controlled tongue. When Margaret knocked on her door, she didn't expect much more than a cup of tea. But she would leave with her mind in turmoil. June greeted her with a firm look and a slight smile. "You're John's sister, aren't you?" The sentence sounded like a sentence. "I knew you'd come back. I just didn't know when." Margaret frowned in surprise. "What do you mean?" And that was when June invited her in and closed the door with a sharp click. "There are things that have been buried too long, my dear." They sat in a cozy kitchen filled with antiques. The scent of cinnamon and sacred candles filled the air. June offered tea and poured it with trembling but steady hands. "John told me everything. Not all at once, but in bits and pieces. Like someone who fears that the truth, told all at once, might kill." Margaret didn't know whether to listen or flee. But she stayed. June began to reveal a story Margaret never would have imagined. Abigail hadn't disappeared by chance. She had been taken. By mistake, or with malicious intent. At the time, Margaret's parents were going through a profound crisis, and a couple far from the family offered to help. A temporary adoption. Except they never returned the child. The family tried to hush up the case. Pride, shame, fear of scandal. And John, he was the only one who never accepted it. He spent his life investigating, writing anonymous letters, searching for clues. He came here many times crying, afraid you would never know. But he said, "If she ever comes back, I want her to know. I want her to have a choice." Margaret felt a chill in her stomach. Everything she believed about her childhood was crumbling. "My sister was stolen?" The question came out through tears. June nodded. "Yes. And she's alive. But she doesn't know who you are. She was raised under a different name. A different past." Margaret's heart felt like it was beating out of her chest. June then retrieved a wooden box from under the closet. Inside were a collection of old letters and photos. "These were left with me. John said that if anything happened to him, I should give them to you." Margaret leafed through the contents in silence. There were photos of a young woman she'd never seen, but whose smile was all too familiar. The young woman's name was Anna Louise. She lived in the same town and taught at a local kindergarten. Curly hair, bright brown eyes. Margaret touched the paper reverently. "Is that her?" she whispered. "Is that Abigail?" June didn't answer. She just nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "She doesn't know. She doesn't know anything." Margaret's world turned upside down, as if time had collapsed in her hands. "You knew all along?" she asked. June looked away. "I knew part of it. But the rest? I pieced it together. I couldn't tell you until I was sure. And now, you're here. And the decision is in your hands." June then revealed another layer. "Anna always felt something was wrong. She told me years ago that she dreamed of a different mother, a different house, a brother who played the guitar." Margaret covered her mouth with her hands. "John played the guitar. She feels it. Even without knowing it, she feels it." It was as if her sister's heart was calling to hers. Margaret wanted to run to Anna. Tell her everything. Hug her. Tell her she was sorry for all those years. But June held her back. "Wait. Don't do this now. The impact might be too great. You need a sign. A right moment." Margaret nodded reluctantly. But inside her, a scream exploded. In the days that followed, Margaret spent more time around the school where Anna worked. She watched from afar. A sweet, smiling, dedicated woman. The children loved her. And Margaret, she cried every time she saw her. My sister, so close, and yet so far away. It was an unbearable feeling, like seeing a piece of your soul outside your body. One afternoon, as she was leaving school, Anna dropped her bag. Margaret instinctively rushed to help. Their fingers touched for a second. Anna smiled. "Thank you." And in that smile, Margaret saw Abigail. But she said nothing. She just smiled back. "God, give me wisdom," she murmured as she walked home. June came to her house the next day with a manila envelope. Inside was a doctored birth certificate, and the original, hidden at the bottom. John got this after a lot of fighting. He never gave it to anyone. Now, it's yours. Margaret felt the weight of the decision on her shoulders. This could change lives, even destroy them. She sought refuge in the Bible, in the Psalms her mother read. She found comfort in Proverbs 3 verse 5, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding." Yes, it was time to stop trying to understand, and start trusting. God would guide. God would reveal. But things took a different turn when, one night, Margaret received an anonymous note left on her porch. "Stop disturbing what's buried. Some things are better left in the past." It was strange, menacing, and for the first time since arriving at the farm, she felt real fear. She showed the note to June, whose eyes widened. "Someone else knows, and doesn't want you to continue." And then came the twist. June confessed that she suspected someone. A name from the past. Someone involved in Abigail's supposed adoption. Someone who was now a respected figure in the town. "You must be careful, Margaret." And Margaret knew, in that instant, that she couldn't trust just anyone. Not everyone was ready for the truth. Some feared it. Others profited from the lie. But she couldn't stop. Because now, her mission was clear. And her faith, unshakable. She returned to the barn and prayed there, on her knees. "Lord, guide my steps. May I do nothing outside of your time. But may I not be silent when it is time to speak." The silence responded with a light wind that made the leaves on the trees dance. It was as if the sky said, "I am here." In the following days, Margaret received another letter. This time, without threats. It was handwritten, but tender. "I know who you are, and I know what you seek. But please, give me time." And signed. But she recognized it. It was Abigail. Somehow, she knew. And now, everything was about to change again. The sun was beginning to set behind the hills when Margaret heard the sound of an old engine approaching. A navy blue Chevrolet truck pulled up in front of the farmhouse. It was like a scene straight from her youth. From the vehicle, a gray-haired man with a look that made time stand still stepped out. It was him. Paul Bennett. The boy with whom Margaret had shared an unforgettable romance in her youth, before the city swallowed her dreams and life tore them apart. They met at the county fair in 1963. They danced to Elvis. They promised the world. But, like so many youthful promises, that one was lost to time. Until now. It took her a moment to believe it. His eyes seemed to see the young man he once was, behind the marks of time. Paul removed his hat, straightened his collar, and said, as if only 50 years had passed, "Do you still like warm apple pie?" Margaret smiled, without saying a word. Because sometimes, only the heart understands. He'd heard about her return to the neighborhood. He'd heard about John's death. He'd heard about the reopened farm. And something in his heart compelled him to drive there. "I thought maybe it was time to see for myself, if it was true." Margaret invited him in. The house breathed deeply with the two of them together again. They sat on the porch with 2 mugs of tea. They talked about everything and nothing. The decades vanished like leaves in the wind. Paul told her he'd never married. "Nobody was you." Margaret swallowed hard. Those words resonated differently now. Not as poetry, but as truth. Like something suspended in time, waiting for its moment. Night fell, and the sky was dotted with stars. Margaret told him about Abigail, about June, about the letters. Paul listened silently, his eyes welling up. "You know, John wrote to me before he died. He said that if I still had feelings for you, it was time to show up. That you'd need someone." Margaret didn't know whether to cry or smile. She felt both at the same time. In the days that followed, Paul returned again and again. He helped with small things, mending the fence, fixing the well, cleaning the barn roof. Margaret watched every gesture. It was as if God was restoring not just memories, but opportunities. As if to say, "There's still time." Paul was quiet, but his actions spoke loudly. He brought her pies from the local bakery. He left wildflowers on the porch. He read Proverbs with her at dusk. Margaret found herself laughing again. Cooking with music. Her heart warmed with small joys. It was a love that required no rush, just presence. But not everything was rosy. One afternoon, Margaret found an old letter hidden in the back of the closet. It was from her, written to Paul but never sent. It spoke of a miscarriage she'd lost during her stay in the city, a miscarriage she'd never had the courage to tell anyone about. The past had taken its toll. She sat with Paul on the porch and told him everything. Crying, shaking. "I thought you deserved to know. That you had lost something, ours." Paul held her hand and said, "We didn't lose it. We just postponed it. And God knows the timing of all things." She burst into tears. But it wasn't sadness. It was release. Their relationship deepened. They were 2 elderly people with young hearts, discovering what it meant to love maturely. Paul began attending local services with her. They prayed together. They dreamed together. And one Sunday morning, Paul looked into her eyes and said, "If you want, we can grow old, together." But fate, once again, would test her strength. Paul disappeared for 3 days. No news, no sign. Margaret felt a panic she hadn't experienced since her youth. She searched hospitals and called acquaintances. Until she received a call, Paul had been in a minor accident on the dirt road. He was hospitalized. She rushed to the hospital, like a young woman in love. She found him lying there, with a shy smile. "I guess I wanted to remind you that life still has surprises." Margaret held his hand and said, "And I still have faith." Because yes, faith was what drove her. From the beginning. Always. Paul recovered. Slowly, but with determination. And when he returned to the farm, he brought something special with him. A ring. Simple. Silver. It's not a request. It's a symbol. If you want, we can wear it together. As a promise. That, until the end, we will be with each other. Margaret accepted. And there, under the countryside sky, 2 mature hearts were united. But a new challenge would arise. Paul revealed that he had also received an anonymous letter. Someone warned him not to get involved with old secrets. Margaret froze. The same handwriting as the note she had received? Who was trying to prevent their reunion? Who feared the past so much? They decided to investigate together. And they discovered that someone in town, someone with access to old records, had disappeared with documents. A local notary, a former employee. The web of lies ran deeper than they thought. But now, with Paul by her side, Margaret felt stronger. Paul suggested seeking help from a retired lawyer friend of John's. The man confirmed Abigail was adopted, but under illegal conditions. Someone falsified papers to prevent her real family from finding her. What no one knew was that this man still lived there. And he was about to be confronted. That same day, Paul and Margaret returned to the barn. They sat together on the dirt floor, the Bible between them. They prayed, "Lord, let truth come. Let love prevail. Let time be no barrier." And in answer, a ray of sunlight shone through a gap in the roof, illuminating them both. Margaret's old love, the one that seemed lost, not only returned, it blossomed. But with it came forces that tried to erase what God wanted to reveal. Paul's presence was a blessing, but also a warning. Because what came next would put everything at risk. The sky dawned strangely that morning. Heavy clouds, no wind. A strange silence hung over the farm. Margaret felt it as soon as she opened her eyes. It was as if something was about to happen. Something big. Something that would change everything. And she didn't yet know that this would be the hardest day since she'd returned. Paul had left early to buy some tools in town. Margaret was left alone on the farm. She was making coffee, looking out the window, and something on the horizon seemed wrong. A thin smoke was beginning to form, far away. But it was spreading quickly, as if in a hurry. She frowned. Did someone set the brush on fire? She walked out into the yard, her heart sinking. The smoke was rising, approaching the east fence. Margaret ran to the barn, and then she saw it. One side of the old structure was ablaze. Real fire, growing fast, devouring dry wood. The barn was on fire. And worst of all, John's diary, the documents, they were all inside. She ran without thinking. He threw open the barn door, choking with smoke. He grabbed a bucket, ran to the well, and poured water. He came back. More water. But the fire was faster. The flames licked the walls as if trying to erase the past. Margaret screamed for help, but no one heard her. She was alone, fighting the impossible. While trying to salvage one of the boxes of documents, he tripped over a collapsed beam. He fell to the ground with a groan. A flame licked his arm, burning the sleeve of his shirt. The pain was intense. But stronger was the fear of losing everything he had discovered. The barn was the heart of the story. And it was dying before his eyes. That's when he heard the engine. Paul. He came running, jumped out of the truck, and went straight to the barn. "Margaret, get out of there," he shouted. But she wouldn't listen. She was determined to save one last box. He went in anyway. Together, through coughs and tears, they managed to get out with 2 trunks. A short time later, the roof caved in. The barn collapsed. In flames. They both fell to the grass, sweaty, dirty, and in tears. Margaret was shaking. It was all. Everything was there. Paul held her hand tightly. "Not all. You're here. I'm here. We still have the truth in our hearts." She wept uncontrollably. The pain of loss was great. But the pain of near loss was even greater. The neighbors arrived soon after. Volunteer firefighters, neighbors with buckets, dogs barking. But it was too late. The barn was destroyed. Ash covered the ground like black snow. June appeared, eyes wide. "My God! Was it an accidental fire?" Margaret couldn't answer. But something in her gut told her it wasn't. Later, firefighters found a broken bottle in the back of the barn. The smell of kerosene. Traces of accelerant. Someone had started that fire. Margaret felt her legs give way. They want to erase everything, every trace. Paul supported her. This just confirms we're too close to the truth. That night, Margaret slept with the Bible on her chest. She read Psalm 34, "The Lord is near to the broken-hearted." The fire had destroyed the barn, but not what it represented. The memories were there. The truth was alive. And the love was stronger than ever. In the following days, Margaret and Paul began to rebuild. They gathered the fragments that remained, charred photographs, excerpts from the diary, parts of the will. And even amid the ashes, they found something unexpected, a small metal can that had been sheltered beneath a fallen beam. Inside, a letter. Intact. It was from John. If everything is destroyed, may this letter survive. Because what God wants to reveal, no one can erase. It detailed information about Abigail's illegal adoption, the names involved, the precise dates. It was more than they expected. It was the missing piece. And it had survived by a miracle. Paul suggested taking everything to the local police. But Margaret hesitated. What if they're involved? The town was small. The ties were deep. The masks were well worn. They needed another strategy. Then they remembered Pastor Walter, from the church John used to attend. A man of integrity. Trustworthy. They brought the letter to him. The pastor read it silently, his eyes intent. When he finished, he said, "I've been praying for years for the truth to come to light. Now is the time." He promised to help. To mobilize friends, to seek out journalists, to make sure Abigail knew. But carefully. With faith. With wisdom. Because dealing with the past requires preparation. Meanwhile, Anna, the woman who was possibly Abigail, appeared again at the farm. He said he dreamed of fire, of voices calling his name. And that, upon waking, he knew he had to go there. Margaret nearly collapsed. It was as if invisible bonds were pulling them both toward the same center. They sat on the porch. Anna looked around and said, "Have I been here before?" Margaret didn't answer. She just stared. And in that look, Anna understood. Her eyes filled with tears. She reached into her pocket for the locket, the same one Margaret had seen in the barn. "I've always carried this, but I never knew where it came from." Margaret reached out, and for the first time in nearly 6 decades, the sisters touched again. Time stood still. The sky seemed to breathe with them. There were no words, only tears, only forgiveness, only recognition, a connection that not even fire could extinguish. And in that moment, the impossible became real. But not everyone was happy about it. The next morning, Margaret received another threat. A simple envelope, "If you continue, the next one won't be the barn." The fear returned. But now, she was no longer alone. She had Paul. She had Anna. She had June. And most of all, she had God. The fields were golden, ready for harvest. The scent of corn, earth, and dry leaves filled the air. Margaret stood watching from the porch, her eyes shining. Despite everything that had happened, or perhaps because of it, she decided it was time. Time to bring the community back. Time for the Harvest Festival. John always organized the celebration. It was a time of unity, prayer, and sharing. Margaret wanted to keep the tradition alive. But something inside her told her this year would be different. That this celebration would be more than a thank you. It would be a milestone, a rebirth, and perhaps a revelation. She and Paul began preparations weeks in advance. They decorated the rebuilt barn with lights, ribbons, and verses painted on wooden signs. Neighborhood children helped pick apples. June baked pies. Anna sewed banners with the residents' names. Everything seemed to breathe love, gratitude, and promise. At the heart of the decor, Margaret placed a table filled with artifacts from the farm's history. Old photos, the medallion, excerpts from the burned diary, a Bible open to Psalm 126. Those who sow in tears will reap in joyful song. It was her truth, and everyone's. On the big day, cars began arriving early in the morning. City folk, farmers, children running through the fields. It was like a reunion of souls. Live music, the smell of fresh food, prayer before lunch. The joy in the air seemed to dispel any shadows. But The unexpected was yet to come. During the afternoon, Paul called Margaret to the makeshift stage. "You have something to say. Something that will touch hearts." She hesitated. But then she felt God whispering, "It's time." She stepped up with firm steps. She took a deep breath and began to speak about faith, new beginnings, loss, and reunions. "This farm taught me that God doesn't forget us, even when we forget who we are." The people fell silent. "Here, I found my sister again. Here, I understood what true love is. And here, I chose to forgive. Because the harvest only comes after waiting. And forgiveness." Many people's eyes filled with tears. Anna, sitting in the front row, wept silently. When she finished her speech, Margaret came down and walked over to her. Taking her hand, she held it up for all to see. "This is my sister. Lost for decades. Found by love." There was silence. And then, a round of applause. Long, emotional, unforgettable. But just when everything seemed perfect, a figure emerged from among the guests. A tall man, gray suit, with a hard expression. Margaret recognized him. It was the man from the registry office, the same one John had cited in his letter as being involved in the forgery of Abigail's documents. He stopped in front of the stage. Tension dropped like a stone over the audience. The man raised his voice. "This is a lie. This woman is spreading slander." Paul stepped closer, firmly. "She has proof. And she's no longer alone." Pastor Walter also stepped onto the stage. "The truth sets you free, sir. And it's coming out, whether you like it or not." The man paled. He knew he had lost control of the narrative. But the biggest twist was yet to come. June, who had been sitting in the back, stood up and shouted, "I saw you handing the fake documents to Margaret's father. I was a clerk at the courthouse back then." Everyone turned. June stepped onto the stage. "And I kept copies. For safekeeping. They're here." She handed the pastor a folder. The villain tried to flee. But 2 police officers present at the event, invited by the community, detained him. One of the officers said, "We were already investigating. Now we have everything we need." The audience was in shock. The enemy was among them all along. But so was God, and he doesn't sleep. With the arrest, the case took a new turn. The community became even more united. Margaret and Anna were officially recognized as sisters. Records were corrected. But what mattered most was that hearts were restored. What time had separated, faith had united again. For the last dance of the night, Margaret and Paul embraced beneath the soft lights of the barn. There was no music, just the sounds of the fields, of laughter, of freedom. It was the sound of a promise fulfilled. Margaret looked up to the heavens and whispered a silent prayer. "Thank you, Lord, for the harvest, for the truth, for everything." And as the party continued, a child approached her, holding a small note. "This was on the church door, Aunt Margaret." She opened it carefully. It was a yellowed sheet of paper, with familiar handwriting. "You have served your purpose. Now, there is one last thing left in the basement." No signature. But she knew. It was John. The harvest festival had barely ended, but Margaret's mind was already elsewhere. The anonymous letter, left on the church doorstep, pulsed in her hands like a summons. "Now, there's one last thing left in the cellar." She knew it was from John. The handwriting, the direct manner. It was as if her brother were speaking to her from heaven. Margaret had never been in that basement. There was something somber about it, a heavy silence she avoided. Ever since she'd returned, she'd felt it wasn't time. But now, it was. She grabbed a flashlight, warned Paul, and descended the old wooden stairs. Each step creaked as if it was crying out to be woken after so many years. The basement was damp, dark, and smelled of time. Spiders, boxes, old tools. She slowly passed the flashlight over it, trying to figure out what she was looking for. And then she saw it, a slightly loose floorboard. She knelt down and carefully pulled it out. There, beneath the wood, was a metal safe. She took the key from the locket she always wore around her neck, intuitively. And to her surprise, it fit perfectly in the lock. The safe opened with a sharp click. Inside was only a thick envelope and a small object covered in an old linen cloth. Margaret took a deep breath and began to read. John's letter was long, detailed, like a spiritual testament. He spoke of Abigail, of the burden of hiding the truth. "I did the best I could, Maggie. But I know you'll know what to do. If you've made it this far, it's because you've overcome everything. And now, it's time to see what was saved for you, with love." She removed the cloth and found a small, handmade music box. As she turned the lever, an old melody began to play, the song her mother had sung to her and Abigail when they were little. The sound filled the basement like a forgotten blessing. Margaret burst into tears. This was a piece of the family's soul. But there was more. Inside the envelope was an official donation document. John had left the entire farm not only to Margaret, but also to Abigail. The land must be tended by the hands of those who feel, those who love. You two are the heirs to our past and our future. The emotion was immense. He had always known. She surfaced with trembling hands. Paul was in the kitchen. Anna was reading a Bible on the porch. Margaret called them over, showed them everything. Abigail picked up the music box and clutched it to her chest. "I remember this. I thought it was a dream. But it was real." The memories finally clicked. In the days that followed, the two began tending the farm together. They planted side by side, harvested, and laughed. Margaret felt something inside her heal with each gesture. The basement was no longer frightening. It was a sacred place now. A vault of healing, of revelation. An altar of memory. But there was one last detail in John's letter that still troubled Margaret. A cryptic sentence: "If the cellar revealed what was left, the west tree will show what was hidden." She read and reread it. What was the west tree? Paul recalled, "There is a tree alone in the west field, where the sun sets." They went there at dusk. It was a tall, ancient tree, with strong roots and branches that looked like hands reaching toward the sky. Margaret approached and touched the trunk. She felt something strange. A hollow part, like a cavity. Paul brought a small shovel and began digging. A few minutes later, they found a deep metal box. Inside the box were letters from their mother. Written to Abigail, but never sent. Letters of love, longing, and guilt. Margaret and Anna read them together, crying in each other's arms. It was as if their mother, even silent throughout her life, had left enough words to fill the void. It was the missing link. Anna was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I forgive." Not just her mother, but her father. Time, life, none of this can be changed. But now, we can live in peace. Margaret hugged her tightly. Paul watched them with tearful eyes. It was a new chapter. Written with tears, yes, but also with grace. News of the sisters' reconciliation spread throughout the region. The farm story became a living legend. Schools took children to visit the farm. Local churches used their testimony as an example of faith, forgiveness, and hope. But none of this would have happened without the courage to open the cellar. One afternoon, Margaret sat on the porch with a music box in her hands. She turned the knob and closed her eyes. The song brought back sweet but also profound memories. She felt the presence of her brother, her mother, even her father. They were all there, somehow. And in that moment, she understood, there was nothing hidden anymore. Only love. But what no one imagined was that the farm's legacy still held one last gift. One that would change not only the lives of Margaret and Abigail, but of an entire community. Because love, when true, never runs out. It multiplies. And in the land where it all began, something would yet blossom. The countryside dawned in silence. But it wasn't the silence of solitude, it was the silence of peace. Margaret rose before the sun, as she had for weeks, and went straight to the porch. The smell of fresh coffee mingled with the aroma of orchard flowers. Beside it sat the rocking chair John always used. Empty, but present. The farm was no longer just a place. It was a testament. It was the portrait of a family that suffered, fell, remained silent, and yet flourished. The land that had once been marked by secrets was now fertile ground for reconciliation. Margaret knew this every time she saw Anna smile or Paul hum an old hymn in the rebuilt barn. Over time, Anna decided to live there permanently. Together, they restored the old backyard. Margaret helped with the details, while Paul planted sunflowers around the farm. It was as if each flower was a new memory, a moment reclaimed. The farm had finally become home again, for everyone. But the most moving part came late one afternoon. Margaret received a call from the school where Anna worked. "She wants to talk to you." Arriving there, Margaret was taken to the principal's office. There, she found Anna clutching a folder and crying. "I want you to read this." She had officially filed a name change application. Abigail Miller. Her original name. Her identity reclaimed. Her story restored. Margaret hugged her tightly. "You always were. Even without knowing. Even without remembering. She was more than paper. She was healing in the form of letters. A whole woman who now knew exactly where she came from. And where she belonged." Back at the farm, Paul set up a bench under the western tree. It was where they gathered at the end of their days. There they prayed. There they read old letters. There they talked about everything. About how the world changes. About how time passes. But also about how the heart always remembers where home is. Margaret began writing letters too. But not to people. To God. Little notes of gratitude, confession, intercession. He kept them all in a box near his bed. And he always said, "If I leave before opening them all, let someone read them. Because what is written with faith is never lost." In one of her letters, she wrote something that summed her up perfectly. "Home isn't where we begin. It's where we find ourselves. Where God plants our roots, even after the storms." That was it. The true meaning of home wasn't space. It was reunion. It was love in its purest form. June, now more frail, still visited on Sundays. She brought cakes, new stories, and always said, "You were the answer to an old prayer, Margaret." The two looked at each other tenderly. They knew that, in that small patch of land, something divine had happened. Something that time would never erase. One morning, Margaret was walking among the vegetable gardens when she came across a child drawing in the dirt. She was the daughter of a couple from the church. She pointed to the drawing, two women holding hands in front of a house. "That's you two, Aunt Margaret and Aunt Abigail." Margaret knelt down and smiled. "That's exactly it, dear." Paul built a small chapel at the back of the farm. Simple, made of wood. There, they held weekly meetings with neighbors. Homely, intimate services, where faith was celebrated unhurriedly. Margaret always read a psalm. And Abigail played a song she'd learned in her dreams. The music from the music box. Over time, more people began arriving. People seeking peace. Land. Home. Margaret and Abigail began welcoming visitors, telling their story. Teaching that God does not forget. That the truth sets you free. And that it's always possible to return. Even after a lifetime of going in circles. One of those days, a woman from North Carolina said, "This earth heals." Margaret replied with a smile, "Because it's not the earth. It's what it holds." And in that moment, she felt something different. As if the heavens were smiling. As if the cycle were coming to an end. But there was one last letter from John, still unread. One that Margaret had treasured, waiting for the right time. One silent night, by lamplight, she opened it. And there, with a final breath, he said, "Home was never the farm, Maggie. It was you. Wherever you are, there will be life. There will be healing. There will be a harvest." She cried, hugging that letter. Because she understood. It wasn't about the house, the field, the barn. It was about her heart. And her heart, despite everything, still beat strong. With faith. With gratitude. She looked outside and saw the porch lights on. Abigail was laughing with Paul. And in that laughter was eternity. And maybe now you're wondering, what really defines a home? Is it the place where we were born? Where we've lived the longest? Or is it that invisible space where our soul finally rests? Margaret's story teaches us that sometimes we have to lose almost everything to discover what was never truly lost. Because God, with His infinite patience, always waits, even when we forget. How many times have you felt like your life needed a fresh start? That there was something bigger calling you, but fear, the past, or even comfort paralyzed you? Margaret could have stayed in the city, living among memories and noise. But she chose to listen to a whisper. She chose to follow a forgotten letter. She chose to return. And on that return, she found not only her sister, her love, and her mission, but also herself. Because when we reconnect with our essence, with what God dreamed for us, everything around us begins to blossom. Even dry branches give birth. Even broken hearts rekindle hope. Even scorched earth bears new fruit. Now, I ask you, have you ever felt like there is something forgotten inside you that needs to be rediscovered? Maybe a gift? A person? A conversation left half-finished? A call from God that you pretended not to hear? What would you do if you discovered that the answer to everything you seek is hidden exactly where you least want to look? God doesn't waste pain. He transforms. He regenerates. And often, He reveals home right in the middle of the storm. Or in the depths of a basement we've avoided for years. Or in the embrace of someone we thought was lost forever. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below telling me which part moved you the most. I'd love to hear it. And of course, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, take advantage now. Click on subscribe and activate the bell to continue receiving stories like this. Stories that speak to the soul, that heal old wounds and remind us of what really matters. And if I can ask you one more thing, don't ignore the signs. Life sometimes whispers. And when you listen with your heart, God responds with miracles.